Hello once again from the Prim Reaper. So, I'm working on the script for another high-minded men's mental health video, and it's one that I think is important too, and I'm all set to try and get that out this month. And then I come across something that really derailed all that and just made me go on a mental tangent. If I'm being honest, it's probably for the best because this month was such a difficult one for me owing to several other major life commitments, so following the trail of inspiration, however silly, is probably to my advantage. I was scrolling through social media when I found this.
Gaston is really the most terrifying Disney villain because he could be anyone in the world. Later, he convinces the whole town to set up his wedding with the knowledge that the would-be bride would be thrown into it. Everyone finds his creepy-ass tactics as cute and boys will be boys-esque. So yeah, he is terrifying. Yeah, the truly scary thing about Beauty and the Beast isn't that Gaston exists, but that society fucking loves him. People who deride the movie by saying it's about Stockholm Syndrome are ignoring that it's actually about the various ways that truly decent people get othered by society. People don't trust the Beast because of the way he looks, which only feeds his anger issues and pushes him further away. Gaston isn't the only one who criticizes Belle for being bookish either. Whole town says that there must be something wrong with her, and her father gets carted off to a mental asylum for being just a little eccentric. Howard Ashman, who collaborated on the film's score and had a huge influence on the movie's story and themes, was a gay man who died of AIDS shortly after work on the film was completed. If you watch the film with that in mind, the message of it becomes clear. Gaston demonstrates that bullies are rewarded and beloved by society as long as they possess a certain set of characteristics, while nice people who don't are ostracized. The love story between Belle and the Beast is about them finding solace in each other after society rejects them both.
I know, like I said, silly. But if you'll indulge my taking a bit of time to criticize the literal message in this image, there's actually some broader themes in here I'd like to challenge that relate to current society as a whole.
So first, let's poke fun at the mild absurdity of the first line. In the Disney universe, there's all kinds of crazy magical nonsense going on. Jafar obtained so much power by the end of his movie as to become a literal genie who could control just about anything in the universe. Ursula had the ability to turn into a 10-story tall sea monster that can control the flow of the ocean. Maleficent cursed a baby to die out of pure spite and had the power to turn into a giant evil dragon. It just seems silly to say, Gaston is the most terrifying Disney villain because he's just some average guy. The absolute horror. The idea that a man could exist in the world with some backwards and outdated views is truly the terror of our time. The point is, it's obvious to the viewer that Gaston's attitudes are wrong. That's the joke.gif. Saying that Gaston could be anyone is off the mark. Anyone who acts the way Gaston does now in most modern cultures is a ticket to being cancelled and having your life ruined. And even that isn't exactly new, although the extent to which it is true has certainly accelerated in the last decade. I was aware his attitudes were wrong in kindergarten, but that's beside the point, isn't it? Because this story is set in 16th century France. Guess what attitudes towards gender roles were in 16th century Europe? Spoiler alert, it wasn't exactly a bastion of equal opportunities for women. Most were expected to focus on their husbands and families, and certainly not to pursue any significant sort of education. In this case, though the city folk of her town do comment on her eccentricities, it's implied that this is not really being done in a mean-spirited way, as evidenced by lines like, "I wonder if she's feeling well," or "That girl is strange but special." It's patronizing, but it's obvious by the way they act that most of them are at least fond of her. Frankly, these attitudes towards a woman like Belle in these times would be understandable if not downright progressive. Remember that this time period aligns right during the time when people, most commonly women, would be labeled as witches for certain unconventional behaviors. And as for throwing her father in the asylum for being just a little eccentric. Well, I'm sorry to tell you guys, but at one point insane asylums were an actual thing, and people got placed in them for much less erratic behavior than making very public claims that there is a supernatural being in a castle in the woods that no one appears to know about. But anyway, let's flip for a moment and look at what behaviors, on the other hand, would be considered in a much more positive light by that society. Gaston, a man who is tough, strong, and charismatic. A man not only well-versed in a useful skill such as hunting, especially for the time, but who is ostensibly the best hunter in the area. A man's man, who is not only capable of protecting and providing for someone, but who desires a large family of his own. All of this in the film is painted in a gross patriarchal manner by today's standards, of course, but there's no denying that by the standards of society in which these people existed, this man would be considered a top-tier catch by almost any woman in existence. This is why the city was all too willing to put on a wedding for him before he's even proposed, because it would be unthinkable that his mountain of desirable traits for the time would be met with rejection. Perhaps some might have had an inkling of an idea that Belle didn't care for him if they'd been privy to her previous interactions with him, but even then they probably wouldn't have suspected that that would be enough for her to refuse a marriage proposal when he still had so much to offer as a prospective partner. It's not the town thinking that boys will be boys. It's the town thinking, well, obviously there's no way Belle would refuse Gaston, and that's a wedding we'd like to attend. And while the statement about bullies being rewarded and beloved if they possess a certain set of characteristics is true to a certain extent, I think it's being framed incorrectly. I think that people will be more willing to tolerate a certain level of jackhassery from someone who is otherwise loved, respected, charismatic, or who is seen as a community leader. It's not that bullies or bullying behavior itself is the thing that is typically rewarded. Now, this isn't always the case, I'm sorry to say, but I do feel like most normal people who possess any kind of human empathy will at least have some disdain for rude, inconsiderate, selfish, mean, or otherwise general bullying behavior. Just because they may be more likely to tolerate it in someone who is otherwise popular or attractive than in someone who is not, doesn't mean that they wouldn't then prefer that popular or attractive person to be less of a festering butthole if they had their choice. I'm reasonably confident the people of the town didn't love Gaston because he does some terrible things to try to win Belle's hand, but rather that they tolerate more of those things from him because they love him for other reasons.
But anyway, the reason why all of these circumstances work as silly or cringeworthy moments in the film is because we in the audience know that they are ridiculous and outdated views. We laugh, or I guess those of us that aren't wrist-wringing feminists laugh, at Gaston's antics because the idea that he could exist in a world that so loves and praises him despite his egotistical, domineering, and, yes, patriarchal ways of thinking seems untenable to us in modern-day Western society. We know that women are every bit as entitled to read and be educated as men. We know that trying to force someone to marry you is wrong. We know that a good portion of things that the other men in the tavern are patting Gaston on the back about in his big musical number are not really things worthy of being proud of by today's standards. All of this is the point. That's why he's the villain of the movie.
But all of this is why the points in this image drive me nuts. They are acting like Gaston is terrifying because he could be anyone in the world. But if anyone in the world really did act like Gaston in the current year, he would be met with anything but the kind of love and adoration that he received in the film. I mean, for God's sake, people have been publicly dragged through the mud for using the wrong pronouns, let alone making a declarative statement that it's not right for women to read. A man who tried to arrange a wedding outside of an unknowing and unwilling woman's house would have the cops called on him, to say nothing of the inanity of the boys will be boys remark. For the millionth time, everyone knows that phrase was meant to excuse childish rabble-rousing, not gross adult behavior or literal crimes. His whole plot to lock up Belle's father wouldn't work either, because we collectively as a society realized how messed up it was to lock up the mentally ill in asylums, and did away with that quite some time ago.
There's a behavior on display here in this post that I find particularly troublesome, especially because of the growing tendency to think like this. It's the judging of past behaviors by today's standards. This is something that tends to occur in different levels of intensity. Consider, for example, the difference in scale in judging past generations for allowing slavery versus judging one individual for a Facebook or Twitter post they made nearly 2 decades ago. However, either way, it's generally a pointless thing to do for many reasons.
First, because it is easy to feel smug judging those in the past by today's standards. We have the extraordinary privilege of living in a time when we are able to access a great deal of information about our history, but this gives some people an unjustified sense of superiority, like they wouldn't possibly make any of the same mistakes were they to live in those circumstances. However, I would caution that no one should feel 100% certain that future social standards will not look down upon anything we have done with the same disdain. Folks like to think that they are on the right side of history with their views, but such thinking really only hinders introspection and contributes to a sense of tribalism and a superiority complex. Don't mistake hindsight for omniscience. Second, because the person engaging in the judged behavior would likely have acted differently under different circumstances. How many of us made edgy jokes as teenagers and were only spared the social media backlash because our edgy jokes were not posted on popular social media websites or even online at all? On a broader level, how would human history have been altered if at any point in the last millennium that generation suddenly had access to the internet as it is today? Third, accepting very obvious cases like mass murder, the social circumstances surrounding an action do impact a lot about it, from the acceptability of the action, to the rationale behind the action, to the responses to the action, and so on. Finally, because it's not like you, or more significantly, the person who engaged in the behavior, can go back in time and change the way they acted or the way things were, so lingering on it is an entirely pointless endeavor.
This kind of attitude often results in a lot of all-or-nothing thinking, like censoring or destroying old material that is now offensive by modern standards, rather than exploring it in the social context in which it was made, and thus understanding what led to someone thinking its original creation was acceptable in the first place. It leads people to look at actions in dangerous isolation and then extrapolate from those actions to mean that whoever did them is a bad person, perhaps even irredeemable. It leads people to believe that they are the moral better of those in the past because they had the audacity to live and act within the boundaries of the acceptable social standards of the time. And hey, in the case of the original image that inspired this rant, it leads these folks to overreach to a humorous extent on how effective a villain Gaston would be in modern times. As one final note, though, I think it really speaks to the cushy life that some people lead, that some out-of-touch narcissistic dude makes for the most terrifying villain in their eyes. There have been some real evils in human history, and I'm not talking about Disney villains. I think our generation has been extremely fortunate to not have to be directly privy to some of these evils. I hope that we are fortunate enough to be able to continue to avoid as much as we can, though I know plenty of people in the world are already not so lucky. But for those of us who continue to skirt through life relatively easy off, I think it gives some people a rather unbalanced view of what constitutes injustices in the world. Gaston is no angel, but Gaston is also no Hitler. The fact that some individuals place the wildly misused idea of boys will be boys at the top of their naughty list just continues to blow me away. Turns out there are some folks as thick as Gaston, just not in the neck. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.